Thank you, Don, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, friends. I arrived to this country 2 years ago. 3 hours before I left the tarmac in the airport, in front of the airplane, I didn't know where I was going. I had been in prison for 2 years. And it wasn't until a police officer told me or asked me to sign a very simple form, just a piece of paper, that I realized I was being sent to the United States. The alternative was to sign the document. Otherwise, I would be returned to prison. So I signed without hesitation. I was deported from Nicaragua, my own country, along with 221 political prisoners. While we were flying, the dictator Daniel Ortega ordered to reform the Constitution and strip out of our nationality. We landed this very city, Washington, stateless. Not only denied the right to live in our own country, but now facing the challenges of building a new life without citizenship. The day I was freed was also the day I was reunited with my wife and my daughter, who was born here in the US. Most of my fellow prisoners were not as fortunate, as they left their families behind, starting yet another period of anguish, family separation, and police harassment back home. Over the last 2 years, relatives of the 222 prisoners, husbands, wives, fathers, have died in Nicaragua, separated from their vanished relatives. My cellmate, Michael Healy, died last year away from his beloved country. In 2018, Ortega reformed the country's social security system, sparkling a wave of protest from all over the country. Started with the elderly, students, and the general population. The regime responded with violence, firing live ammunition against the protesters, killing more than 350 people and wounding thousands. The Catholic Church called for a national dialogue between civil society and the regime. I participated in those talks, but sadly, the government used the dialogue as an opportunity to consolidate power and escalate violence. Many of those who participated in the dialogue, like myself, but also bishops, priests, were imprisoned or forced into exile. Since 2018, as a member of the opposition, I faced constant threats, beatings, and harassment by government sympathizers and police officers. Without any legal reason, I was first banned to travel outside my country to do human rights advocacy. Then I was prohibited to leave the capital city of Managua, and eventually I was banned to leave my own house. In January 2021, under increasingly harsh repression, I announced my candidacy for the presidency of Nicaragua. And on June 8th, 2021, I was kidnapped. 40 people, 40 police officers stormed into my house, arbitrarily arrested me, and took me to jail. While in prison, I was held incommunicado for 3 months, denied visits, denied communications from the outside world, and denied legal counsel. My trial took place inside the prison, violating Nicaraguan law and international standards. My trial was a farce. The witnesses were all police officers, and I was not allowed to talk to my lawyer until 2 minutes before my trial. On February 23rd, 2022, the day of my birthday, I was sentenced to 13 years in prison for so-called crimes against the homeland. Despite appeals and legal challenges, the Nicaraguan judiciary, which is a tool of the regime, ignored our efforts. My wife was accused of treason for work advocacy for my release and had to escape through the woods to Costa Rica and eventually to settle in the US. I spent almost 2 years in prison, separated by my loved ones, isolated from the world, but during this time, I learned about solidarity and about resilience. The most question I'm being asked, what is it like to be 2 years behind bars? Every known international standard, known as the Mandela rules, were violated. We faced degrading treatment, discrimination, especially the women, and were isolated from the outside world. We were denied reading or writing material. Our sleep was difficult as we were under 24 hours artificial light, while at the same time, we were denied sunlight on weeks to end. Family visits were infrequent. In total, we spent 6 months without seeing our families. There were no letters or books allowed. Medical attention was inadequate. And tragically, one prisoner, retired General Hugo Torres, died in custody due to lack of care. Sanitary conditions were poor and the food was insufficient, leading to weight loss and disease. Some prisoners endured solitary confinement, while others were placed in punishment cells for months in small places without ventilation. Interrogations were relentless. I counted 400 of them, usually taking more than an hour, sometimes several a day, especially after the arrest. There was no privacy, and our dignity was disregarded. Religious ceremonies and the Bible were prohibited. There was a strict ban on communication among cells. The only exception was to speak in a very low voice within the cell with our cellmates. The conditions were designed to break us, to limit our ability to share thoughts and share ideas, to limit our ability to pray. We solved this issue by learning communication with sign language, and we became very good at it. So how do you survive in such conditions without losing your mind? For me, it was a combination of an intense physical and spiritual exercises. I will walk from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m., rounding about 3 times the space of a small cell and doing 700 push-ups per day. We pray the rosary twice a day and the St. Ignatius prayer every night with its powerful first sentence. Take, Lord, receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my whole will, all that I have and all that I possess. You gave it up to me, Lord, I'll give it back to you. Sundays were reserved for cleaning myself, cleaning the cell and resting. I also meditated for an hour while my daughter was lighting a candle at the most sacred place on campus where she was studying. This routine kept me focused, keeping worries and negative thoughts at bay. Negative thoughts are very common in prison, even if you are innocent. For example, I started to realize how my fight for democracy and my decisions were affecting the people that I love. A sense of guilt plagued me as my wife and daughter were suffering tremendously for a fight over something I consider important, but extremely costly. I felt selfish for not putting family first. Prison can either break or make you stronger. It can awaken the worst in someone, like it did to Dictator Ortega, who spent 8 years in prison. For me, prison made me realize about so many things, made me realize the true value of life and the consequences of every action that you take. Maybe realize the beauty of the sky that I could not see, or the embrace of a loved one every 6 weeks or even longer. Prison confirmed my commitment to justice. Justice not driven by revenge, but by the need of reparation. Liberty came finally, February 9th, 2023. We were awakened in the middle of the night, placed on buses, and not told where we were going. After an agonizing drive, we arrived at the airport. There, a plane carried us to the United States. Our misery had ended, and a new life was beginning. That same day, as I mentioned, I was reunited with my wife and my daughter, nearly 2 years of separation. During the flight and in the following weeks, we were treated with compassion. We were treated with generosity by US officials, members of US Congress, dozens of NGOs, religious organizations, the church, and private citizens throughout the US. Extremely grateful. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about my personal experience and the issue of migration from a slightly different perspective, a perspective that I also included and explored in the article that Don mentioned, migration and the Catholic teachings in the context of a repressive regime. Nicaragua is a clear example of the politically motivated use of migration from or by an autocratic regime. It violates Catholic teaching on the right to stay, migrate, and return, and it violates international law. First, Ortega exploits migration to reduce political pressure on the regime and to secure resources necessary to keep the economy afloat. Second, the regime has turned Nicaragua into a major transit hub of third country nationals seeking to enter the United States. Ortega has weaponized migration in the context of his hostility toward the United States and European countries. 7 years after the crackdown on protests, an immigration crisis had erupted in Nicaragua. Since between 2019 and 2024, approximately 800,000 people, or 13% of the population, have left, mostly to the United States, Costa Rica, and Spain. The Ortega regime has barred the relatives of political active leaders from re-entering Nicaragua, violating the fundamental right of nationals to return to their own countries. Even those who are not politically active have been prohibited from returning, effectively forcing them into exile and statelessness. While violating the rights of Nicaraguan nationals by refusing to use passports to some living in exile, Ortega has significantly increased issuing passports for Nicaraguans living in the country to promote them leaving Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan regime has stripped more than 500 opposition members of their nationality at the time that the United Nations was leading a global campaign to reduce statelessness. This action, which violates international treaties, has disrupted the lives of thousands and led to the violation of fundamental rights, including the right of identification and the access to social services. The Nicaraguan regime has also confiscated the properties of political leaders, including my own, properties of NGOs, business leaders, organizations, educational institutions, and even the Catholic Church. The crackdown on the entire opposition leadership in 2021, just before the presidential elections, triggered an unprecedented exodus as hopes for a peaceful resolution of the crisis faded. Encounters between United States border patrols and Nicaraguans in 2021 increased from 2,000 encounters to 164,000 in 2022. I repeat the numbers, from 2,000 to 164,000 in a course of 1 year. The Ortega regime, which has driven this exodus, is motivated by both political and economic interests. Politically, with Ortega's declining popularity, migration serves as a means to rid the country of opponents and reduce anti-government sentiments. Additionally, the regime encourages migration to the United States, allowing new immigrants to leave so they can send money back to the country. Remittances increased from 2021, 15% of GDP to 27% of GDP in 2023. The increase has been the largest in Latin American history. The Ortega regime has also exploited another form of migration for political purposes and economic gain. Migrants from third countries heading to the United States. By the end of 2021, Ortega has opened the border and adopted an open policy to promote Nicaragua globally as a destination for migrants from around the world, allowing them to enter the country and continue their travel north. It is estimated that between 2022 and 2023, approximately 628,000 people from various nationalities arrived in Managua International Airport and continue their journeys north. 628,000 people in Managua alone. Initially, flights from Port-au-Prince, Havana, transported thousands of people to Managua and then followed by flights from more distant destinations like Morocco, Senegal, Libya, Pakistan, and India. The Ortega regime is using Nicaragua as a platform to send migrants to the United States for political purposes. A staunch enemy of the United States, Ortega is exploiting people's need to migrate as a means to strike a blow and sow discord within the United States, essentially weaponizing migration, a familiar tactic used by autocracies. Ortega's action must be considered a mirror of the strategy employed by the dictator of Belarus, who used his country as a platform to send migrants in a kind of hybrid warfare against Poland, Lithuania, and the European Union. Dictators do not care about their own people, let alone people from other countries. Their disregard for human dignity leads them to use migrants as mere tools to extract resources and as political weapons. They fail to respect the dignity of those seeking opportunities elsewhere and inflict suffering on their own citizens. As I mentioned earlier, Nicaragua has experienced an unprecedented and massive exodus of people fleeing for both lack of opportunities and repression. Many of these individuals enter into the United States through the humanitarian parole program, which was just revoked last week. Hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans now face uncertainty about the future. For many of those Nicaraguans, deportation means prison or torture or both. I sincerely hope that the life-threatening nature of our situation as Nicaraguans is carefully considered by the authorities of the countries receiving Nicaraguans. The case of Nicaragua is also unique in another regard. Hundreds of priests and nuns have been deported or denied re-entry to the country. Over 200 religious figures from various denominations have been expelled, including members of the Sisters of Mercy, Franciscans, and Dominicans. In 2023, the legal charter of the Jesuit order was dissolved, and the UCA University was eliminated and confiscated. This situation has led to the exile of many priests and other leaders and members of the Catholic Church who live as refugees and asylum seekers around the world, severely hindering their ability to assist others in Nicaragua and elsewhere. Since biblical times, people have suffered persecution and exiles. Modern-day tyrants like Ortega continue to persecute, continue to exile, and continue to kill those who they see as enemies. The Bible has always been a source of inspiration and hope for those in prison and in exile. That's the reason why they banned the Bible in the first place when we were in prison, because it's full of stories about the suffering and resilience of the people of Israel. Just as in ancient times, today's victims of tyranny seek refuge elsewhere, trying to rebuild their lives, contribute to society, and find a future where they can live in peace. The story of my life that I'm sharing is a testament of the reality that the right to stay in one's homelands is too often violated by those who abuse power. Human dignity and fundamental rights are desecrated every second in many parts of the world, including my country, Nicaragua. It is important to realize that every migrant, every asylum seeker, every refugee has a story, and that generalizations cannot be made. The social teachings of the Catholic Church regarding migration becomes extremely relevant at this moment because it holds the principles that while people have the right to stay, they also have the right to migrate when conditions become unbearable. States have the moral duty to protect human dignity and ensure the families are not torn apart. At the same time, states have the duty to regulate migration and ensure safety. Vulnerable people must be allowed to flourish in a new land when their dreams at home are destroyed. Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I believe we still have some time for questions. So any question, feel free to share. More than happy to. Yes.
Thank you very much for your moving speech. I'm Bill Barbieri from the Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. You mentioned that one of the distinctive things about Nicaragua was its very special program of persecuting members of the church there, clergy especially. I saw some news coverage that proposed that there was a special rationale for doing that and that the Ortega administration was seeking to perhaps to gain leverage, much in the way that China has, in order to negotiate control over the church. I just wondered if you have any insight into that view.
Absolutely. Nicaragua has become some kind of a combination of Stalin's Soviet Union, a monarchy in the Middle Ages, and North Korea. And I'm not exaggerating. And China example as well. The Ortega regime calls themselves socialists and Christians at the same time. They have used extremely harsh words against the Pope. The Pope has responded. And what seems that accommodates Ortega is the ability of the Vatican to appoint bishops, which is obviously something that is respected almost in every country in the world. But that particular thing, and the fact that he has not eliminated the appointment of the two bishops that are in exile, and one of them, Bishop Alvarez, was in prison for 2 years. It's making them the idea of trying to get this capacity to appoint bishops. So they're very uncomfortable. On the other hand, the level of religious persecution has increased in Nicaragua. Holy Week processions will not be allowed. Priests have to ask permissions every day to go to say mass, and they are prohibited to pray for peace in Nicaragua. So, and if they do that, if they do something that is not allowed by the spies that are always in the temple, they will be sent out of the country, has been continuously happening. That's the level of persecution. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. A bit of a follow-up question. Given what you saw in Nicaragua and continue to watch between the government and the church, and now living in our country and beginning to see some of the struggles between churches, including the Catholic Church and the government as it emerges, what advice would you give to the leadership of the Catholic Church?
Well, I think the Catholic Church has demonstrated a great deal of leadership when injustice happened in my country, in Nicaragua. They stand when the regime of Ortega started fighting live ammunition. They basically and literally, physically put themselves in the middle of the repression, stopping and defending the rights. And that gave many of the bishops an extremely important position in there. They acted like shepherds. They acted like what they needed to be. So I feel very, very proud. I mean, I was raised Catholic, but for me, it was extremely important to see the clergy taking a step defending fundamental rights. Does I respond, Father?
Thank you very much for your very powerful description of the. Thank you very much for the very powerful description of what you've been through and the reasons why you're here rather than in Nicaragua. It raises for me the question of how the United States, can be supportive of the right to remain. You have been forced into exile. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about the abuses by the Ortega regime in your country. Do you think there is something that could be done by our government in this country vis-a-vis in relation to Nicaragua that could make it more possible for people like yourself to remain in Nicaragua? I guess I'm asking a question about whether there's a political maneuver that could be made to try to reduce the amount of oppression that's happening in Nicaragua that's causing you. And that might be an example that could show us how we could respond to some of the other parts of the world where there's such serious repression also, although what you've been through is an extraordinarily severe example of that.
Thank you, Father. The level of repressions in Nicaragua is, as I mentioned, at the level of North Korea. And I don't see the Ortega regime willing to actually reduce that level of repression. He's been in power only because he's got control of the army and the police. So in order to stay in power, he had to maintain that level of repression. He is completely, he's not listening to the, and I'm putting it nicely, the international community at all. He has renounced Nicaragua's position in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Human Rights Council. He had gone away from the Organization of American States, being the only country to do that. So when you deal with tyrants like that, it's extremely difficult to, and this is something that I do all the time, been to European Parliament, British Parliament, European Union, Congress, talking to the administration about the importance of keeping pressure, political pressure, knowing that Ortega is a very kind, special tyrant that doesn't really care about the international community. It's becoming more and more isolated, the North Korean kind of argument. But I think the story of Nicaragua can also lead to some considerations for other countries. And, autocrats. Ortega didn't get elected, and he got elected through dividing the Liberal Party. But he didn't get elected saying that he was going to be a dictator. So I think, the lessons are important elsewhere. How Nicaragua is a pathetic case of dictatorship at the extreme, but signs are very similar in many other countries, starting with the fight with the media, human rights prosecutors, the church. So all these signs, I think, and that's why we're writing a book with my wife, telling our personal story, but also tell the story how autocrats evolve over time and how autocrats ended up being what they didn't say they were going to do, but it was in their mind. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. So just to follow up on Father's question, I guess just very briefly, what about sanctions? I know Nicaragua is designated as a country of particular concern. And at the IRF summit, they discussed a lot about how sanctions could be attached or deployed through that designation more specifically in a targeted way. Is that something at all that you advocate for?
Yes. Sanctions are controversial because with good intentions, people in Europe or the US say that sanctions affect the people of those countries. But I don't see any effect on people in Nicaragua's country by sanctioning the president or the vice president, or sanctioning a corrupt minister of finance who's funneling resources to the paramilitaries to buy weapons. So as far as they are targeted and they are used to reduce the power of those authorities without affecting the general population, I think that they should be implemented, no doubt, and try to build a case for these people in international courts. There's a demand to put Ortega, as happened with the Philippines dictator last week, to put him in the Hague, for example. We are promoting or helping lawyers in Argentina, where in the international universal local legal system is accusing Ortega for crimes against humanity. You have to do these things in order to build pressure. Sometimes these regimes defend these personal and targeted sanctions, saying that affect the general public. And sometimes they are picked up by honest people elsewhere, and they tend to believe the story. But there's a lot of families of types of sanctions. Now, there is another element in the case of Nicaragua, and that is that Nicaragua is part of the free trade agreement. It's a privileged commerce relationship with the region and Nicaragua in particular. So usually when I talk about this, I say Ortega is putting that privilege at risk because, the violations of human rights. There is an association agreement with the European Union that has democratic clauses, human rights clauses, and clearly Ortega is violating. So he is the one who's putting these privileged positions at risk.
So we have one more question online. We can go ahead.
This question is from John Kingery. He asks, what lessons can we learn in the United States? I am concerned about our faith leaders who are on the sidelines or given tacit support for mass deportations. Y gracias.
Well, I'm a political activist and a politician from Nicaragua fighting for the democracy in my country. I do not get involved in local discussion on policy, local policies, as I don't like people from other nationalities to talk about local politics in Nicaragua. So I really want to be very respectful on that. However, my story is a story of someone who was forced to leave. My colleagues in Nicaragua are facing a great deal of uncertainty. And I can only say that, and I hope, and I'm sure the faith leaders already have, as part of their commitment, to have this sensibility about the importance of being sent to a place where torture is being practiced, but also the message to those in charge of administering those processes as well. That's as much as I would like to say. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we are going to take about an hour for lunch. We'll be back at 1:30 p.m. We have lunch served out here in the common area. And thank you.